This seminar will be broadcasted live and recorded, so you can watch it afterwards if you would like to on the webpage of Sommartorg, Säkerhetspolitiskt Sommartorg. So at the end, when we will have questions, it's very important that you speak in the microphone so that it will be recorded. And you're also very welcome to tweet from the seminar, and if you do, please use the hashtag Sommartorg, and then other people can find you. Yes, I think that was the practical things. So as I said, good evening and welcome to this seminar on small weapons. Oh, did I disappear? No, I did not, sorry. On this seminar on small weapons, big problems. What can we do to stop the world's deadliest weapon? That is the issue and the question that we will be discussing for an hour now. The organizer of this seminar is Kristna Fredsrörelsen, the Swedish Fellowship of Reconciliation. And my name is Gilljam, and I'm the communication officer at the Swedish Fellowship of Reconciliation. And I will be moderating this seminar. And as you can see, we have a brilliant panel with us today, and I will get back to the introduction of these three people standing up here together with me. We will be discussing what can be done by the international community, Sweden, and civil society organizations to stop the world's deadliest weapons, small arms and light weapons, which can be defined as arms and weapons that are easy to carry and easy to handle, and therefore also easy to transport, and they also have a relatively long lifespan. And small arms are in fact the real weapons of mass destruction. They kill approximately 500,000 people each year. That equals 1,370 people every day, which means that when we will leave this room in an hour, 57 more people will have been killed by one of these arm types. 57 people. 57 people with families and with friends. And many of these do not live in a war zone or in a war-affected society. As an example, we have Guatemala, where more people are dying today than during the Civil War. And one of the reasons why has to do with small arms and light weapons. And the illicit trade of small arms and light weapons is a very big problem, which makes it hard to control where the arms and weapons end up. And these are some of the problems associated with these weapons, which we will come back to during this hour. The Swedish Fellowship of Reconciliation has been working for stricter arms control worldwide and with violence prevention for many years. One big focus of ours has been to work for a global trade agreement through the Control Arms campaign, where we were a part of the coordination. And last year, the Arms Trade Treaty also was adopted by the UN in June. And our work now is focused on pushing for a strict interpretation of this treaty. And we work closely with other organizations, particularly in Latin America, the continent which has the highest numbers of people affected by armed violence in the world. And through the network CLAVE, which is abbreviation for La Coalización Latinoamericana para la Prevención de la Violencia Armada, the Latin American Coalition for the Prevention of Armed Violence, we work together with and give support to various organizations throughout Latin America, working with advocacy, arms control, prevention of armed violence, and developing policies, etc., etc. And one of them is Sudapaz, where one of our panelists is from. During this hour, I would like all of us to bear in mind a story of a woman in Argentina. And her story can show us an example of how people are affected by small arms. She participated in a photo exhibition on armed violence organized by one of our partner organizations in Argentina, APP. They organized a photo exhibition on violence against women. And they asked women all over the country to send in pictures of how their experience with violence. And they got a lot of pictures, and one of them was on a bullet lying under a bed next to a pair of shoes. So APP contacted the woman who had taken this picture and asked, from where does it come? And she said that my husband puts that bullet under my bed every night as a reminder that if I don't do what he wants me to do, then he can use that bullet. And this woman's story is just one of thousands and thousands of how people are affected by small arms and armed violence in their daily life. And when you talk about arms control, violence prevention, you often get quite technical. You talk about human resolutions, conferences, this and that, laws and restrictions and everything. But at the end of the day, what it all boils down to is how all these actions and papers and laws and policies can help that woman in Argentina and all others who are affected by armed violence each day. So I would like to remind our panel to also keep this woman in Argentina in mind. How can all of these actions help her in her daily life? So with us today we have Karin Olofsson, who is policy advisor on peace and security at SIDA, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Daniel Mack from the Brazilian organization SODAPAS. And you work with violence preventions, etc. And also Peter Brune from the International Action Network on Small Arms. And you can present yourself more if you would like to. So we will start off with an introduction to this topic. When at the Swedish Fellowship of Reconciliation, well, we often have workshops and things, and often we use an exercise that is called the scale, perhaps, I don't know. And I thought we will start off by doing that. Now we can't do it as we're supposed to because we're stuck on this in this chord. So, but if you imagine this stage to be a scale from nothing at all to everything possible, nothing at all in this end and everything possible in that end, where would you say, or where would you put yourself if you could? And what would you say the international community does to prevent armed violence and prevent small arms and light weapons? And also, according to your area of expertise, what would you say is the main problem with small arms and light weapons? I think we will start off there and see where it goes. So Karin, if you please, you can start.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you, Maria, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a very important issue to discuss and also to reflect a bit on the aspects that you were raising about, and also to keep in mind all the personal human stories behind this development obstacle. And actually, I would say, working at SIDA as a civil servant, of course, you can also see like different layers in this questions and also the answers to the question. But I would like to say then that the international community has not done everything possible, because if it would have been the case, we wouldn't be here today discussing this as a big problem. So sadly enough, it's still a big problem. But I would say that it's not nothing at all. I would say that during the recent years there has been some progress in this field, and I will think we will come in more into detail about this progress. But what you also mentioned in your introduction, Maria, there's been this negotiation of the arms trade treaty, and that's a progress. And I know that many of you organizations in here, and I mean not least WIFOR and other civil society organizations, have been working hard and mobilized the Swedish audience and international audience and public for making this negotiation happen. It has not entered into force. Sweden took the decision, the Swedish government took the decision and the parliament like last week, a little bit more than a week ago, and it became like the 41st country. But it has to be like 50 countries in order that ratifies in order that for the treaty to enter into force formally. So I think it's important also to see the progress that has been made, but of course a lot remains to be done. And also, why is armed violence and small arms and light weapon a development obstacle? I think that we can see today also that, and we have a lot of evidence, a lot of studies, a lot of evidence, a lot of research being done upon this. And in development cooperation, we can see it in many of our cooperation countries that it is obstacle. And why? Yeah, because in brief, it's just like the impact. It has like huge negative consequences. And I mean, for human beings in everyday life, you can see that, of course, I mean, the loss of someone near to you, and it affects you in your daily life, and it's a personal loss, and also for the community, for the society as a whole. So I mean, and you can never measure this kind of human cost that it has for a society that is really affected of armed violence. And you also have an economic cost. And the economic cost has been measured. I mean, if you think about Africa, a couple of years ago, this research institute, Small Arms Survey, made and Control Arms Secretariat, they made a study upon that, and they counted that Africa's missing billions, that is $18 billion per year, was the loss on behalf of Africa due to the effects of armed violence. So you can see that there is like a huge economic consequence of this also. And you can also see that it affects the institutional framework in societies, and also make that the people affected, they don't get access to basic social services, health, education, etc. And that is why it's so important to see that the concept is like human security. It has to do with increasing the human security, because you have the human being there, and the human needs and the conditions of the human being. I mean, if you know the traditional concept of security is like the national state. Now we have to go beyond that and see all the needs that a human being has. I mean, both economical, social, health, educational. And that is very clear also because as a development cooperation agency, we are governed by the political steering documents on our government, from our government, and we have a document there, a result strategy when it comes to thematic support, different initiatives for increasing human security. So we can see that it's clearly linked also. And just one last reflection, because you also mentioned a little bit, why is it different compared to maybe why small arms? I mean, if you compare to other types of weapon systems and weapon types. I know that, I mean, peace movements, civil society globally, many different actors, the UN, has during many years raised the importance to put focus on the SOLVE issues, if we abbreviate it like that, the small arms issues. And I also remember that just a month ago, I went to a seminar that CIPRI arranged with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, where the Hans Blix, I don't know if you know Hans Blix, I mean, he's a former Swedish diplomat, and he also, like, maybe he was mostly known as the former head for the International Atomic Energy Organ. And he said, I remember he was having a presentation, and I mean, he has vast experience from many different kind of weapon systems. And he was like ending his presentation with quoting that the small arms and light weapons are the mass destruction weapons of today.
Yeah. Thank you, Karin. We could move on to Daniel.
Take it away. Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much to Swiffer for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, reflecting on your scale exercise, I think I'd be a lot closer to where you are. And I think, as Karin said, surely there have been some very significant issues that have progressed in the past few years. But I think if we think about the international community as a whole and issues of armed violence and what we have done, and I think it really is a we, it's a collective we of civil society and governments and UN agencies and so on and so forth, I think we've done shockingly little. For a massive problem of over 500,000 people killed by armed violence on a yearly basis. That doesn't include probably 3 to 6 times more that number of those that are injured, and that again doesn't include the example from Argentina, which is the fear, and this is a very common occurrence in South America and in Central America particularly. Living in fear of armed violence and how that impacts one's enjoyment of life, and I think I think looking at it in terms of the international community also may mask some peculiarities, in the sense that I think it's very uneven how much countries have done to try to at least minimize this scourge, and I think there are some countries that have done a fair amount. There's a majority of countries that have not, and I think so. I think possibly the international community is this kind of amorphous group that doesn't, if you break it down into kind of a little more disaggregated data, as it were, I think you'll start seeing some patterns of many countries that could do a lot more than they do, and in that sense, and I for instance, I'll be the first one to say that I know nothing about the Swedish government, so I'd be interested in hearing some views on that. Just from as an outsider, the impression that coming from Latin America is that Sweden is not one of the countries that has been at the very top of many of these issues, particularly regarding on small arms and armed violence control, and of course. I think going back to the issue of progress or not, I think we are at somewhat of a watershed moment, in the sense that precisely because the Arms Trade Treaty was successfully negotiated, and I think Peter will be speaking more about the POA also, which is a very important UN framework for small arms. There has been a fair amount of progress on this. And so if you take a kind of a glass half full view of it, I think it's possible to be somewhat optimistic. I'm not an optimist. I view the glass as very much half empty. And I think that this is, for both civil society and governments, we're at kind of a historical moment where it behooves us to take a very critical assessment and a critique of the situation. What have we done? What has the international community, what has each of our governments done? And think about whether there could be a shift into some other issues that would possibly be a little bit more impactful. Part of what we've been doing at Solapaz recently is this exercise of trying to brainstorm a little bit. What have we done so far? What could we do from now on? And we came out recently with a publication called What Next? Thoughts for Global Civil Society Working on Armed Violence Reduction and Arms Control, which, if any of you have trouble sleeping, I highly recommend. It's about 100 pages, and it'll put you to sleep in no time. But what we were attempting to do there is looking precisely at where are we and where do we need to go? And the answer we came to is that what we've done in the last 10 years, particularly on an international level, is vastly focused on some limited aspects of the armed violence reduction agenda. Particularly, we've looked at, through the POA and through the ATT, we've looked at the international transfer of arms, and then on the other side, through negotiations on landmines, cluster munitions, so on and so forth, we've worked on banning particularly horrible weapons. That's not enough. That's extremely important, but there's at the UN all these seemingly interminable negotiations and discussions at the UN which many of you know. There's a constant mantra in UN documents when it comes to small arms, and it's about the illicit transfer, the destabilizing accumulation, and the misuse. Those are three factors. The last 10 years, the international community has focused primarily on just one of them, which is transfer, international transfer. And the knowledge we have now vis-a-vis the knowledge we had 10, 15 years ago shows us that, in fact, it is less the international movement of arms, but the existing arms already in stockpiles around the world. There's 875 million small arms in the world today, and at a clip of probably 5 to 7 million a year, increasing. There is a lot to do as far as some very simple issues, others that would demand a conceptual change, a shift in the ways of thinking. But this is something that we are thinking that both civil society and governments need to tackle. As difficult as it is to deal with destabilizing accumulation, quote unquote, which goes into issues of production and surplus and destruction of arms. It is important to tackle these in a more serious way if we want to have any chance of actually reverting the tide. What we have now, I don't know if this is even something you say in English, but in Brazil we say you're mopping the floor with the faucet open. And that is what we're doing when it comes to small arms control in the world today, that we are desperately doing the best we can on a very finite aspect of the problem, and the problem continues to be exacerbated over and over and over again. And if there's not some attention to those very structural issues, some of which have to do with issues of very high economic and political power, it is very unlikely, I think, that we're going to be able to actually do anything other than just, slightly minimize the carnage year after year. And in that sense, all of us as civil society and all governments have really to step up their game, I would argue. One of the things that we've been looking at in this question, what can the international community, and then particularly from the civil society perspective, what can we do? We've come to the conclusion a bit that civil society particularly is a bit addicted to the UN, and it's, as all addictions, it's a little bit difficult to break. I might start shaking myself, but that is a very and I think it's a very natural. The UN is the seat of international global power. It's the seat of decision making for so many of these issues. There's a natural elan to it, but also a natural it's a natural route to go when you have a global issue of such a magnitude that you would necessarily go through that. In our opinion, what the last 10-15 years of UN discussions and debates have shown is that, to a certain extent, it's like using a hammer to fix a television, in the sense that it is an important framework, it is an important way of doing business, but it's only one of a myriad of other tools and frameworks that both civil society and governments could use, and perhaps we've been using less than we should. So coming from that, one of the things that we recommend that civil society and governments, particularly progressive governments like Sweden, governments that are truly concerned with human rights violations and the level of gun violence around the world, is to help return to the nation state a bit, as it were. That a lot of the advocacy and a lot of the public policies really need to happen at a national basis. And of course, it's in many ways it's more sensitive because there's an issue of governments kind of interfering with other governments, and it's messy, it is complex. There's almost 200 members of UN states, and every single one of them has different ways of looking at the issue. But it's really, in our opinion, the seat of where a lot of the small arms control issues should go back to. And just when we speak of kind of small arms in an international international arena, and then the issue of armed violence, we'd also urge closer attention to the issue of gun violence particularly. And the reason for that is that armed violence is this kind of broad concept, which is very helpful in some points, but in others, I think, masks some of the realities there. And it's a bit akin to a doctor saying, "I treat cancer." Well, no, you don't treat cancer. You may have some issues that you can work on prevention for cancer at large, but each cancer has a very specific way of impacting. And this is true of armed violence. Armed violence is a tremendously localized phenomenon. What is true, in fact, sometimes in São Paulo is not true in Rio, which is 600 kilometers away. And if you try some kind of cookie cutter approach that's going to be one size fits all for everyone, it's bound to fail. And so when looking in this renewed focus on gun violence, the reason for this is quite clear: is that the most mundane of these lethal instruments, particularly pistols, revolvers, other things that we see in popular culture, are responsible for the vast majority of incidents, both homicides, injuries, and the fear that comes with them. So I think one thing that we've missed a bit is in the discussion small arms and light weapons, is that this a bit anodyne kind of gives a veneer of respectability almost to a class of weapons, that we really need to come back to what are the national policies that we can use on a basis that's going to be different for every country. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated and messy, but this is how it's going to be done. So just quickly, some of the issues, for instance, on small arms that particularly civil society and progressive governments can do more on, issues such as civilian possession, looking at small arms as the real tools of human rights violations. I mean, we have the separation, as Maria said before, the separation between war and peace, as it were. And what you have with firearms really is war in peace, because you have, of all the armed violence numbers in the world, about 90% of them happen outside of conflict in countries supposedly in peace. And this is organized crime, not so organized crime, interpersonal homicide, so on and so forth. This is something that human rights framework and attention, particularly from large human rights organizations, coming back to this would, I think, be of interest. And finally, as I said before, I think we really need to think about what's behind, what's coming. We're starting sometimes at the point of transfer. We're not thinking about the production. We're not thinking about demand. Why are people demanding so many weapons, even civilians in so many societies? What makes them think that they feel safer with a gun when all the science proves the opposite? But nonetheless, that political argument hasn't been conveyed well and won.
Okay,
I think I'll stop there, because I could even tell that I was babbling. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we will get back on the point where you talked about Sweden as a progressive government. Maybe Peter has something to say about that. And where would you place yourself on this scale?
Unfortunately, as the two previous speakers as well, quite far to the east in that sense. But at the same time, I mean, we are moving towards westward, where the problem lies to a high extent as well. That direction in the US, but also in other arms-producing countries. But we are moving towards the right direction. At the same time, of course, it's obvious. I mean, 6-7 million new small arms produced every year, firearms, only a fraction of that being destroyed. 12 billion bullets a year produced. That's 2 for each inhabitant of this planet. One person killed per minute. So those are figures that kind of may sound very discouraging. But I think we are moving in the right direction. We have not done very much. There's a huge potential to do much more. But we have done a lot if you look at what has been achieved since the first UN program in 2001 was adopted. And I think we have to have that perspective here as well. And to that comes that there are really strong forces against stronger arms control. And those we should analyze as well quite a lot. And it's a problem in our societies. I mean, it's enough to mention names like Anders Breivik, Mattias Flink, Peter Mangs, all these people who actually have killed a lot of people in our societies as well. So it is a complex issue, and we have to be very strategic and very smart to be able to see that we pursue this path of combating the problem. I have a lot more to say, but maybe I'll hand back to you there first.
Yeah,
so
but
I
would like you to continue on Sweden as a progressive government. Would you say that Sweden is a progressive government on this issue?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, I'm going to the end of my life until this changes to continue to say that Sweden is among the biggest producer and vendor of arms in the world per capita. And it has gone up with 300% in the last, I think, 10 years or so. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the increase of Swedish arms production and selling to abroad has gone up to enormous amounts, and also where the strong feeling in the population is against it, we continue to export to dictatorships, which is absolutely incredible. But it just goes on and goes on and goes on. So in that sense, we are not a progressive government. When it comes to kind of signing off UN papers and so on, and paying money to organizations that do good things, well, then we are quite progressive and are considered being a peaceful country. But no other country is militarizing the planet as much as we do per capita. So that was not on small arms, actually, but I think we must make people in this country aware of that problem, and it will be dealt with at here at Almedalen
which will be dealt by on the stage tomorrow.
But it is also,
we will have a seminar on that issue.
Small arms we are also producing small arms in this country and exporting as well.
So Karin, the role of SIDA in all of this, how can what would you say is from your perspective, what can you do about these problems that we are facing globally? And where do you step in? Daniel talked about the nation state, and that is also on a political level, of course. But as an agency, what is your role to play?
Yeah, and also to continue where I stopped a little bit earlier. Also, it has to do with human security and the focus on increased human security, and there and based on this strategy that we have on behalf of the government, that what we are doing there is like focusing on strengthening institutions, organizations, working with decreasing the existence of small arms and light weapon and arms in general. And also we are focusing on justice, you can say also, by trying to increase the access to justice on behalf of affected people in post-conflict and conflict countries, and also other countries where we are present, because of course we are not only in this kind of countries. So I would say these are like very important parts. And if we link also to, if we look at the World Development Report in 2011, that also highlighted, it was not only focused on small arms and light weapon, of course, it was focused on countries suffering from armed violence and fragile countries as such. But they were like highlighting like 3 crucial things to work with and really to address in these countries. And it was security, I mean human security in the broader sense, like we talked about earlier. And also it was the institutional part, to have governments and to have local national institutions that could be responsible to their citizens and make them be sure to enjoy their full rights, and also employment. And there you can see, why am I mentioning this now? Yeah, because in all of the research, I've also seen that the lack of opportunities for young people is crucial in this. And I worked and lived in Guatemala for several years myself, and I can see that, of course, you can see in all of these barrios, you can see in all of these neighborhoods in Guatemala, and mostly in the poorest neighborhoods in the northern part of Guatemala City, you see, young teenagers running around, and lack of school opportunities, and also lack of real opportunities employment. Where do they have a kind of belonging? Well, in the maras, in the groups organized there. I mean, both boys and girls, although maybe you can see more boys there, but both boys and girls. So I see there is where we come in when it comes to development cooperation, that we can work with different kind of sectors and issues that we know, that we have evidence based on, that these are important in order to prevent these groups coming into armed violence and being recruited to maras, for example, these gangs in Central America. I would also like to mention it when it comes to gender equality. This is vital. And because, I mean, women, peace and security is a prioritized theme for us in general when it comes to development cooperation. But when it comes to armed violence, you can see that also women suffers a lot. You have girls and boys, of course, and you also globally, there are many, I mean, the majority of the victims are male. But indirectly, you can see that many women are also suffering a lot, and you can see that also by the presence, like the anecdote, the history that you were talking about a lot in the beginning, that also this indirect threat that is present with a huge amount of weapons circulating. So we are working with different kind of, to mention something concrete, that we are working with the UNICEF program globally. They are working in their turn in more than 100 countries. And they are both doing policy work, I mean, working within the UN to make sure that child rights is taken into consideration within the UN negotiation and the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, for example. They are also looking at women, the role of women, together with UN Women. And also we are working with Safer World, an organization present in many countries, for example, South Sudan, Somalia, etc. Countries that are also suffering from these issues and this development obstacle. They are working a lot together with the police also, and trying to do awareness raising in communities about, because it has to do a lot with values, of course, and it had a lot to do with, we know from Guatemala, it's a very militarized society. I also lived and worked for SIDA at our embassy in Colombia. Although there is an ongoing conflict, I mean, Guatemala is post-conflict. But I mean, in both of these societies, you can also see that there's such a militarized society. So you have a huge idealized vision and perception upon weapons. And there we have many Swedish civil society organizations that are doing impressive work when it comes to working with values, working with changing values and bringing into no violence methods and different kind of youth groups and alternatives to being recruited by a gang. Mm-hmm. That you can feel that you have, as a young person, boy or girl, you can feel that you have a belonging in some other kind of context. So I mean, I can see that on behalf of SIDA we are doing several things. Mm-hmm. And then we have all of the structural reasons. I do agree upon that, but I think also it's a political responsibility there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Peter, coming back to you, yes, we talked about SIDA, and Daniel said that the civil society organizations are a little bit addicted to the UN. UN, there was a conference in the UN this June on this issue, and there has been a long process on controlling. Where would you say that we stand today with the UN?
I agree that we kind of put the UN kind of as, well, the UN should solve everything. But you have to remember that the UN is only a coalition of governments. It's an intergovernmental agency, so it won't be stronger than the governments themselves. I remember I was in the Swedish delegation in 2004, the UN conference, one of all the different UN conferences on small arms. And we were pushing the Swedish government. You have to include civil society in your delegation. And they say, okay, you can go with us in the Swedish delegation. So I went there, and then President Bush in those days, he said, well, that's okay. If civil society is included, I also will include civil society in my delegation. I will include the National Rifle Association in my delegation. And I said, well, I represent 3,000 Swedish people. And then the NRA guy came and said, I represent 4 million people. I'm representing the biggest NGO in the world. And that's correct. Well, my only position in that situation was to say, well, I think my arguments are much better than your arguments, and I will convince you that my arguments are better.
Did you succeed, I wonder?
Well,
he had a gun, the guy. So that's a little scary.
No, but I just heard that the NRA has opened an office in Peru, in Lima, to kind of spread their message, which is quite scary. But at the UN conference now, there was a father from a school shooting, and his 6-year-old kid had been killed. 19 kids were killed, and the father spoke. And there happened something unprecedented at that conference, actually, because the chairperson of the conference, an Afghan diplomat called Zahir Tanin, whom I happen to know, he stepped down from the panel, and then he went to the father and called for a moment of silence. I wasn't there, but I heard it afterwards. And then the father, and after this presentation was the NRA speaking. So then the chairperson, this Afghan diplomat, he left the room together with the father because he didn't want to hear the message from the NRA saying we need more guns, we can protect ourselves. Precisely that kind of statistics that Daniel mentioned correctly is absolutely wrong. It is counterproductive. The more armed you are, the less safer you are. But this is those kinds of arguments which really are very hard to get into some people's heads. The UN conference, as I said in the beginning, if you look at what was in 2001 and what we have today, there has been progress. Do you agree to that as well?
Sure.
Okay. And now in the
last, not that bad.
No, exactly. Now we can come back to the details, but there has been progress. But one of the great achievements, as I have understood it, is that one has really taken more into account the role, the protagonistic role of women, not as women's only, but into policy making, for example, which hopefully in the end will save lives. And that's what it is about. I mean, there are far too many people being killed by the armed violence, and it leaves so deep scars in a society. If young people between 18 and 25 are killed, often they have already kids and so on and so on. So it's such a burden on a societal level as well.
Yeah. Daniel, you said we have to bring it back to the national state. Would you like to explain a little bit more what you mean with that, and what do you think is the role of civil society in that process of pushing our own government?
Sure. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the seat of power that controls issues regarding small arms is clearly the national governments. And then you have in many places, including in Brazil, you have some breakdowns of how the federal state, the states, and the cities interact with each other, and who has the police. And so, I mean, there's always many levels from the community level to the completely global level. But the thing about national policies, which I think is striking, is that we've somehow in this progress over the past 10 years or so, we've gone to a place where, particularly because a lot of these discussions that we spoke about before, civilian possession, misuse of firearms, and then the role of ammunition, which is something that that's something that all of us, have to do
Well, we failed at the UN conference as
right,
well.
but and that was precisely my point, is that so many of these issues, because they couldn't go through that prism, they were kind of left. And it more says about how those UN processes were the wrong vessel for the issue, rather than that the issues are not incredibly important. And so I think what happened in many of these issues, and I think, again, there's a mea culpa for civil society and governments alike here, is that there are a lot of issues that you just couldn't push at the UN, because when you start getting into the US and the NRA and their national delegation and writing policy points and so on and so forth, there's a relationship with firearms in the US that's very different than anywhere else. And I think, I like to think that in 50 years that can be changed in a very, very drastic manner. And I think there's demographic reasons to believe that will be the case. I think that there's communications and knowledge reasons for that. But the US will be a few decades behind, let's say, Northern European countries, which have highly regulated, the ones that do have some form of civilian possession of weapons, or have very highly regulated systems, and very low armed violence levels. So I think one of the problems with trying to kind of come with these global solutions onto each jurisdiction is that they're really vastly different, and they have these kind of endemic and ingrown trends and cultures and so on and so forth that you can't really just in one swath change the entire world. I think in that sense what civil society and governments alike really have to look at it in a kind of a dual track. There's things that you can do internationally, and one of the things I think most importantly you can do internationally is knowledge sharing, communication. So you have from a normative perspective, you have in Brazil you have a pretty good law, a gun control law for the last 10 years. In West Africa, you have an important regional instrument on a lot of these issues, and there's progress varies in many issues differently. Being able to harmonize that a little bit more through bilateral, multilateral communication that doesn't necessarily entail, a big bureaucracy or a diplomatic process. A lot of this, I think, can be done in the absence of formal negotiations and so on and so forth. And really, one of the things that I think happened, particularly in this, when we had these speed bumps of certain things that just couldn't go anymore at the UN, conceptually we kind of went over them and said and went into speaking more of armed violence and the effects and so on and so forth. And while that's very true, and I think what Karin was saying is very important, because it would be, if anybody tells you that they're going to address an endemic gun violence problem with only work on guns, they're lying to you. It's a multi-causal, very, very complex issues, and there are issues of criminal justice, of how a society in a system deals with drugs, drug consumption, alcohol consumption, police reform. These are all things I mentioned, which are things that Soda Paz does in Brazil, precisely because as important as the issues of gun control are, and they are a focus of ours, you can't do them by themselves and expect that to be a silver bullet solution to any of this, because the problem is that big and the problem is that complex. So I think ensuring that all of this is cross-fertilized is important, that it's not, we kind of go back to remembering that, yes, the guns are extremely important, but also not go off the other side of the edge and just focus on that, because in fact that would be counterproductive as well. Yeah.
You've come into the future a little bit here, Karin, if and Peter as well, if you could just briefly, before, because time passes quickly, so we will have some questions soon, but I just want to have some short comments from you on, if we would meet here again in 5 or 10 years, what do you think we would be discussing at that moment, if we should have organize a seminar again in Almedalen on small arms and light weapons? Karin, just briefly, what do you think?
Well, we meet here in 10 years, and I can see a vision that we discuss. How did we succeed with finalizing all development cooperation in regards to armed violence, the effects of armed violence, because there is no armed violence anymore. No, but I mean,
it sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. No, but I mean, and I also hear, because I think it's important to say, it's a vision, and it's important to have visions. And I mean, on behalf of development cooperation, we also have the vision to not be needed. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of ours also, the day that we are not needed. The world has really succeeded in being developed, and people are enjoying a life in freedom and without poverty. But anyway, I also asked here, because it was important also to consult the colleagues at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, because they are the ones with the main responsibility also to follow this with the Arms Trade Treaty, and also when it comes to the UN meetings and so on. And as they were mentioning also that they see the progress upon this area, and that they estimate also that maybe that the Arms Trade Treaty will come into entry in within the scope of 3-4 years, and that it will be like within 5 years we will begin to see effects when it comes to the existence and proliferation of small arms and light weapon in conflict and post-conflict countries, and mainly in Latin America, Caribbean. So, I mean, in itself, it will not solve any conflicts, and it will not bring about revolutionary changes, but the Arms Trade Treaty could be a first step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
When
the landmines were about to kind of be dealt with in the Ottawa Convention, there were some 50,000 people a year killed per year by landmines. And Sweden said, we need the landmines to protect our borders, blah, blah. And now it's less than 1,000 a year. So that's a significant change, from 50,000 down to less than 1,000. That's 1,000 an hour that are killed, a day that are killed by small arms nowadays. So I think what we'll see is both more knowledge about local success stories. There are local success stories, and that will disseminate, where you can see in some mega cities where it has really been possible to bring down the death rates. We will see, I think, also some stronger instruments on some matters. Hopefully ammunition, we failed this time, but maybe in the next round we will manage to also include ammunition. Many small steps, but that it's kind of a necessary kind of step-by-step approach that is needed in this. So in 5 years, I think we can say that, well, 10 years ago we were there, 5 years ago, 15 years later, well, we have still advanced. So I am, in that sense, optimistic and thinking that we are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, let's keep that optimism. Thank you all so much. Now we can open up for questions. We have another 10 minutes on the seminar, so if anyone has any question, Henrik will bring you the microphone. So just raise your hand, and please keep it a little bit brief, and then and a question, not just a remark, please. We have one there, yeah.
Okay, hi.
I think it's on, yeah. You can, yeah.
All right. I'm not so sure. Yes, it's on. It's on? Okay, thanks. Hi, I'm Efren, and I know all the three panelists. I know you, Maria, but congratulations. Good moderation of this panel. I worked before in the small arms community, and I don't have so much of a question, but rather an encouragement, because I think, now you mentioned that the process of reflection, and hopefully it's not only inflection, but it will also have some kind of that we will be able to be more forward-leaning in the small arms community. There's some low-hanging fruits. You mentioned one of those, Karin, for instance, in the 1325 work. There's a lot of no-cost small arms work that we could do if we just use that momentum that is in those questions, for instance. And I think that also from a national perspective, talking about Sweden, I think that we're at a moment where we can actually redefine our disarmament and non-proliferation policy in Sweden. There was some time ago since someone took a comprehensive view of this. And you mentioned the sort of, it feels like an oxymoron to say it, but when we talk about the lifespan of a weapon, and you mentioned the production, Daniel, I think that that is definitely the next horizon for us. And I think that both of you mentioned, Daniel and Karin also, the true price tag of a weapon. And economic instruments are probably the next generation that we need to look into. Let's treat the small arms in the same fashion as we do with other dangerous goods. We tax them. They have to pay damages for it. And all other tools available that we have at our disposal, we need to use also for weapons. But of course, I mean, they have their own nature. But I think that it would be very interesting if you could, Daniel, together with Peter and others, if you could challenge the Swedish government as much as you possible now, and at this formative moment, which I believe it is in this argument and non-proliferation, and tell them this is what Sweden should do to once again be in the global forefront, and I'm definitely not talking as a foreign ministry officer now.
You have some short comment on that, yeah?
Okay, yes. I mean, in the UN Program of Action from 2001, it is foreseen that there should be a national commission on small arms. So far, Sweden has yet not installed a national commission, so that's something they could do quite easily. So that goes to SIDA as well. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, we have one there.
My name is Ellen, and my question is, we see mostly armed violence and a huge amount of small weapons in developing countries, but we see as well developed countries producing small weapons. So who do you think has the biggest responsibility in this problem? Should we disarm the conflict areas first, or should we focus on legislative power to prevent the production of small weapons?
Daniel, would you?
I really think, I mean, it's as much of a cliche as it is, I really think it's a shared responsibility. I think the issues of supply and demand, like anything else, are very powerful. But I think what you see is, and I must say, including in my region of the world, there's sometimes there's a victimization of the northern countries are selling their weapons and they're killing all these people. Well, first of all, for instance, Brazil is the world's fourth biggest exporter of small arms. Most of the violence in Brazil is done with arms that are made in Brazil. About 80% of what happens, and so I think it's really a question of both exporters and importers have huge responsibility, and as Efraim was saying, there's issues of, I think, legal liability responsibilities that in most societies go completely unaccounted for. But you really have to tackle both of them because the supply is at the level as it is, and especially North American, European countries have these markets of arms because the demand is so high in so many of our countries in the so-called south of the world. And I think, again, if you try to tackle one of them, you wouldn't do this for any other kind of problem, a public health problem, or any other kind of product. You wouldn't look at just the supply side of things or just the demand side of things. And it's really, it's just one of these things that adds to the complexity of it. But I take issue when, including countries in my region, just point the finger and say, it's all a question of the exports from North American and European countries. Well, but who's buying them? Someone has to buy them. And once you've bought them, who's keeping their hands on them or letting them be diverted into criminality, into so on and so forth. So I think it's a full spectrum problem, and everybody, and that's really why every country has a responsibility to be doing something about it. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but it sounded like I might have.
We have a few minutes left, so if we have another question. Yeah.
I'm not very knowledgeable in this question, but I would like to hang on to your question and follow up there, and that is because if we look on Sweden, for instance, I mean, our export of arms is not small arms, but it's definitely a question which is very important for the Swedish government in terms of the economy. Is it the same with the export of small arms? Does that spill over to a strong state interest, economic interest of exporting?
Who wants to answer that one?
I think it's a matter of demand, actually, and you have to also do something about the demand. In countries where the gun violence is high, and in that sense, I think the most it has to go hand in hand. But it is necessary to kind of change some cultural behaviors when it comes to kind of thinking that you need to be armed to protect yourself, or that it's a kind of a masculinity thing, etc., etc. So I don't think that the income side when it comes to arms is so important. The cost side, yes, that you can. That's much more expensive for societies. So I'm not that sure actually about the job aspect or the money aspect of it. Not even for Sweden, but that's another question. I don't know what's your opinion.
I would add just a quick thing to that, is that I think there's a vast difference between kind of traditional war equipment and small arms. And there's also another issue, another category which I understand Sweden is particularly strong in, with, is just a kind of high-end technology, dual-use equipment, whatnot. And I think those are vastly different materials to produce and to export. I can understand to a certain extent the economic reasoning, particularly in some of the like high technology stuff, but some of this, particularly small arms, I think it's really, every time you hear these, oh, well, it's going to save 3,000 jobs and so on and so forth. Just as an example, Brazil hasn't signed on to the cluster munition treaty banning cluster bombs, and one of the things that Brazil says, and Brazil has been a producer, is that, well, we can't because it's going to cost something like 4,000 jobs. Now, when you go and look at that, the 4,000 jobs, they're counting even the guy that makes the pen to sell to the factory to write the document and so forth. It's like such an inflated sense of economic value. And then even the arms industry, including small arms, which is for Brazil the biggest kind of piece of the pie, is something incredibly negligible in economic terms. And so I think the economic argument is understandable to an extent, but I think it also has to be put kind of relativized and put into really compared to what kind of society and what kind of country, what's the vision for the country? Is it one that is benefiting from some of these sales? Who are you selling to? Obviously, is an extremely important aspect. So I think just to put a little caveat on the because that's one of the main pushbacks that you always hear from industry types, is like, oh no, well, we provide housing and food for 14 billion people. Well, there are not 14 billion people in the world. It's like the numbers are always a little bit inflated. So.
Okay. Yeah, we have to finish now. Thank you all so much for coming, both you in the panel and to you in the audience. This was the final seminar on Säkerhetspolitiskt torg for this first day in Almedalen. But we'll have more to come tomorrow, and I'll take this in Swedish. Vi börjar klockan 9. Det första är ett seminarium som anordnas av Röda Korset, Internationella kvinnoförbundet för fred och frihet och Folk och försvar och Myndigheten för samhällsskydd och beredskap, som heter Europa i förändring, vem ska skyddas och vem skapar säkerhet. Det händer imorgon klockan 9. Sen fortsätter det hela dagen, så ni är varmt välkomna tillbaka. Thank you all for coming, and thank you in your panel.